Today I want to start diving into working on the engine, which is out of the car. As you guys know, we were waiting on a whole bunch of parts such as clutch, flywheel bolts, header studs, the list goes on. But luckily all the parts came in. So I figured it'd be a good time to start putting the engine back together, especially because we got a lot done in the engine bay. I really love how these tubs came out. Oh man, this is so good. And we also made the lower radiator support and a quick release core support. There's only like a week or two left to potentially drive this car before winter comes. It may not be officially winter, but I count winter as soon as they start putting salt on the streets. And the trees are starting to lose all their leaves, which looks nice, but is sad because winter is near. Man, this thing looks super good when it's wet. That's how you know the clear coat's really bad on it. So if you guys remember, we actually took off the old clutch and retapped all of the header studs. As you can see, the original flywheel sitting here. So it's just an empty transmission housing right now. So luckily, taking this apart will be a breeze. Since we're planning on putting everything back together, I'm gonna go ahead and take out all of these paper towels, because I have seen it where people have forgotten to take those out and left them in there and causes major issues later. And all the threads are cleaned up and ready to go. Super satisfying. I found this method to work the best at removing studs. Basically, I'll put a ratcheting wrench. I'll grab the size of the ratcheting wrench. It's important to make sure the wrench is facing in the right direction. And then I'll put a nut on it facing the wrench socket, and then put another nut. Alright, I did end up putting those towels back in the cylinder head, and that is because I need to clean up this gasket material that's still on here. Oh yeah, that's super clean. I will note I was only lightly putting pressure on here, just enough to get the surface cleaned up, because you don't want to go too deep and then make a groove in your head, because that'll be a definite exhaust leak. Alright, now we can officially take these out of here. Then we got some new studs. Alright, so here's what we got. We have new studs, 12 fat washers, which I guess are called yoke manifold. Then we have the washers that go on top of this, then the nuts, and we also have a new header gasket. Beautiful, all straight from Nissan. And it is important to note that the shorter thread side is the side that goes into the head. And before I put the header on, I think I'm going to call the local powder coating company again to see if they have their machine ready or not. But while I wait to hear back from them, I'm going to pull the trans off and we can start putting on the new clutch kit. I guess we're gonna have to do this manually. I was dumb and forgot to bring my battery back home for my impact because I brought it home to charge it. It's a really weird feeling to take off a transmission and not see a clutch. We have a new flywheel and a clutch kit, which came with a pilot bearing, ferrule bearing, pressure plate, and clutch. So the first thing I want to do is make sure this pilot bearing is correct. So slide this on the input shaft of the trans. Perfect fit. We have this puller tool here, and we're going to use this to pull out the old pilot bearing. A lot of people use like a bread trick or a grease trick, where you basically just mash a whole bunch of stuff in there and pound it out. This tool I've never had any issues with, so we're going to use this to pull it out. And that was a complete success. Only took about a minute to do. And here's a good test, old versus new pilot bearing. So here's the old one. Put on the input shaft and you can wiggle it and you can actually hear the play. Here's the new one. Can't really hear the play. And it also feels a lot tighter than the other one. And if you don't replace your pilot bearing, what could happen is your input shaft bearing could go out after a while, because your input shaft is naturally going to have some play. If there's too much play where it sits, then it could be slopping around on the inside of the transmission. It could make the transmission fail prematurely. Another thing that's really good to take care of is the rear main seal, but we're not going to be doing that because I didn't order one. Totally forgot. This one is not leaking, so not really worried about it. Before I press in this new pilot bearing, I wanted to show you guys where it bottoms out. Right on that little ridge in there. So I personally like to put just a little bit of grease on these before I put them in. And this is high temp grease. I just put the smallest amount on the very top. Now before I push this in here, it's a good idea to figure out what socket you can use to push this in unless you have a punch. In my case, I don't have my punches here, so I found this 14mm socket and it fits in here perfectly. Not only that, but it fits around the diameter of this perfectly. And then we'll hammer this bad boy on there. Now we zoom in there, make sure it's bottomed out in the right spot. Now we can start putting on the new flywheel. Now something I like to do, since this flywheel did not come in the same kit, is I will test fit the clutch on there first and compare it to the old flywheel, because they're not identical and it was not OEM. I could not find any RB25 flywheels except for this one random one that was on Amazon. So we've got our 3 dowel pins on here as well as this one, 6-hole flywheel. Ooh, this looks nice. It's like this interesting felt material. Clutch discs fascinate me. How does this grab all of that power and abuse? This tiny little thing with this super soft felt. So before I test fit this on here, I don't want to contaminate this friction material, because when they ship these, there's grease all over them to prevent it from rusting. So we have some brake clean. Give it a nice wipe down with a clean rag. And usually the flat side is the flywheel side. Then we'll take our pressure plate, and this is also greased from shipping, so we want to clean that off as well before that contacts our friction material. Now we just align our dowel pins on here. Make sure they all line up. It looks like they do. We have 1 pin here, 2, and the 3rd one. Now there's always some controversy whether or not you can reuse OEM flywheel bolts. So here's my bag of clutch bolts, which were the flywheel and the pressure plate. Figured I might as well upgrade to some hardened bolts. Got some ARP bolts. These are actually reusable, which is super clutch. And I don't typically use their assembly lubricant. Instead, I use red Loctite and then torque to OEM specs. But now that I think about it, I forgot my torque wrench in the work truck, which my girlfriend's currently driving because I took her car today. Well, 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 look who showed up.
Want to try a sip of my coffee? What?
Ugh, don't like coffee. What you got going on today?
Check out my new ink.
Nice. Definitely fits the flow of your arm. Well, thanks for bringing the work rig. Uh-oh, where'd I put the torque wrench? I hope it's in the trunk. Yep, there it is, all the way down there. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this before due to all the comments that are asking, but what I do for work is actually YouTube full-time, and also I fix cars on the side. And a tool that I'd recommend to anyone that wants to do something like this is an OBD2 scanner, especially if it's an emissions-related concern. You definitely want to know what system has failed to give you a head start in the repair. Which brings us to today's video sponsor, Carly Connected Car. This is actually a Bluetooth OBD2 scanner. All you need is your phone and download their free app, and I'll show you guys how it works. First, you locate the OBD2 port, and on this car, in most cars, it's right under the steering column. Got our lights on. And then open up the Carly app on your phone. Connect. So here's our options. We have health report, live data stream, and other features. The health report will show any codes going on with the car or any issues that are found. It looks like we do have an issue here. And what's awesome about this app is if you're not familiar with the systems within the car, you can read up on it and it has all the information you need to know within the app. And then it'll also give you a clue as to what the probable cause could be, which could save you a ton of time with your diagnostics. I decided to also check out the Chevy Cruze that's here as well, just to make sure everything's all right. Okay, let's check out a live data stream on this car. So let's select some items we want to take a look at. Oh, that's cool. Calculated engine load. Okay. All right, I've selected a few more items. I'm going to hit start readout, and then I'm going to start the car. That's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to watch the engine load change and also the timing advance. Fuel pressure as well. It's super useful for diagnostics. This tool will really come in handy, especially in the Midwest where emissions checks are every year or every other year, because this also has an emissions readout and it can tell you if each monitor is ready or not. And if you go to readiness, this is for this engine cycle. So as soon as we start the car on, that's a new cycle, and it shows you that the catalyst is incomplete. because you have to drive for a while for the catalyst to heat up to its operating temperature, so that makes sense why that's not ready. So I highly recommend this tool if you plan on fixing cars on your own, or even just to help out others and make sure the car is doing all right. I'll leave a link below so you guys can check it out, and I'll also include a discount code so you can save a few bucks. Shout out to Carly Connected Car. Thanks, guys. So comparing the ARP bolts to the OEM bolts, just like to visualize what's going on. It looks like the ARP bolts are slightly longer. Let's test fit this flywheel, and we're going to loosely put on the rest of the ARP bolts onto the flywheel before we put on the red Loctite, and I'll show you why. It's always a good idea to start these by hand just to make sure they go in enough. And I almost never use an impact on flywheel bolts. Now the reason we didn't put the Loctite on just yet is because we want to seat the flywheel to the crank pulley first. And I'm not bottoming out any of these, I'm just making sure that they all go in at an even pace. And the reason I don't like using an impact to set on these flywheel bolts is because if you think about it, if you're impacting onto this is literally the crank, and the crank has the main bearings attached to it still. So if you're impacting it, all those little vibrations could weaken those main bearings. I have seated these bolts onto the flywheel against the crank. These aren't torqued to spec and not like super cranked down tight. So now we take off one at a time, put some red Loctite on it. It's important to alternate bolts when you're taking them off, and also I'll put a blue dot on it if it already has Loctite. That way I can keep track. Now that we have all of these with red Loctite, the next thing we want to do is torque them. The torque spec on the RB25 flywheel is 105 foot-pounds. I usually like to do torque specs on something like this within 2 or 3 passes. For this one I'll just do it in 2, so I'll probably start out the torque wrench at about 80 foot-pounds. And I installed a flywheel stopper, which is just a 1/4 extension. Luckily it fit through here and bottoms out through the block, so that'll keep the flywheel in place while we torque it down. I'm going to mark the very first bolt that we start with the torque sequence, which is this one right here. And all of these things that I'm telling you guys, how I do this and everything, is stuff I have learned over the years working at performance shops. This is how everyone else has done it, this is how I've been taught to do it, and I've also been taught in school to do some of these methods very similarly. Since this is more of a performance application, obviously I'm going to use the more performance approach, especially with aftermarket performance parts, if you count bolts as performance parts. First round is done, and we have started here and basically skip one to this one, this one. You definitely want to alternate these because you don't want this to warp as you're putting the flywheel on. This is a very tight surface for it to press into. Now we're going to up it to 105. All torqued up, flywheel is officially installed, and the very last thing we do is mark a line on each bolt heading towards the outside. So basically heading out like that, and then you want to put a line on the flywheel that matches up to it. That's how you can tell if these bolts have spun on you. It's just a very professional way to keep track of things. And again, this is what we did at every performance shop that I worked at. Now the best way to install the clutch is just get your tool, and then there you go. Put it right in. And then let it sit there very carefully. But since we're in this deep, you already know what's coming. Leave yourself a little note just in case you're in this deep again. Beautiful. As much as I would love to use ARP bolts for the pressure plate as well, I'm actually going to reuse these pressure plate bolts. Especially because these bolts only take 25 to 33 foot-pounds of torque. That's really not too much, so I'm not really worried about reusing these. But I will still Loctite them, and I will torque them in sequence just like I did the flywheel bolts. And you don't need a nice professional shop to do any of this. I mean, look at my work area right now. I'm doing this on a very dirty garage floor with absolutely no space and just a basic toolbox that I've had for probably 9 years now. So it doesn't take anything special, it just takes the right knowledge to do it. Okay, now we have all the bolts tightened. Before you torque it all down, you want to make sure you can pull out your tool and put it in easily. If it's really difficult to take out and really difficult to put back in, that's exactly how it's going to be putting your transmission on. So that's just a little tip to think ahead. Trying to put a transmission on, especially by yourself and especially under the car by yourself, is very difficult. We're going to put these at 33. And we're going to follow our start pattern. It's number 1 right there. Now because I'm OCD, I go around the whole thing twice, but now that it's good to go. Sweet. And now we draw our torque lines. So here is the throwout bearing that I took off of the clutch fork. And it's got this little spacer guy on there. And if you can hear it, it's definitely making some noise. So it's definitely due for replacement. This spec clutch came with a throwout bearing, but I also ordered an OEM one from Japan. But it's kind of weird because this one, which is the OEM one, actually has a wider diameter than the one that I'm taking off. And for the spec one, this one actually looks a little bit closer, but still wider than the one I'm taking off. Okay, now we're gonna press this spacer off of here. And by press, I mean hammer out with the socket. Now let's match it up and see which bearing looks closer. All right, I'm gonna go with the OEM one. So now if you're gonna hammer this back on, make sure you don't hammer the top where the bearing is. If you hammer this section on the top, you could damage the bearing on the inside. So you wanna only hit on this inner race right here. Now we've got the fork and the throwout bearing ready to go, but before I install it on here, I think I wanna clean it out a little bit. There's just something so satisfying about spraying off all this gunk in here. Oh my gosh. Does anyone else clean out the inside of their transmission, or is it just me? Now that I've degreased everything, all these shiny parts actually need some grease on there because those are going to be metal to metal contact points, and even along this shaft here. And I like to put just a tiny bit here. It's really important not to put too much grease, you know, because this is spinning. That'll cause grease to fly out and contact the friction material on the clutch, and that will cause the clutch to fail prematurely. So we got our high temp grease. Paint a little bit on there, just enough to make sure this slides nicely. So you can kind of see that spring in there. You want that spring to hug this pivot ball. There you go. That's where the slave cylinder connects. Yeah. Well, now we have the trans attached to the motor, clutch kit installed, ready to go. I've already started cleaning up this heat shield. This is how it used to look, all nasty, rusty. And with just a wire wheel, it polished up really nice. I've used this stuff before and it wasn't too bad. I'm not gonna say it's better than powder coating, but whatever, it's just a heat shield and I can always just get this done later. Man, this turned out so good. And for the header, I did also clean up the surface where the gasket meets. And I didn't go crazy on this. I didn't polish the whole thing because, I mean, this is going to be covering it anyways. The only spot that you're really going to be able to see on the header is where it mounts up to the engine. I like to start with just a light coat, just so it can grab onto the material a little better. Because if you put the layer on too thick on your first go, then it could drip off. It's looking super glossy now. Hopefully it dries that way. Now these gaskets are directional, sometimes they're not, but in this case they are. So this side is all flat. And this side has like a metal plating, I guess. The metal side goes towards the engine, and this flat side goes towards the header. And now we'll get our nuts and bolts. And here's the order. Fat washer, these are directional. The bottom side is wider than the top. The top side is machined flat. The bottom has a bevel. Then the washer. Then the nut. Also directional. And these are also locking style. We have all new studs, bolts, and washers. Now what I'm going to do is lightly tighten all of these down so they are bottomed out. And I'm also starting from the inner two runners and working my way outwards. This is how you prevent warpage of the manifold and cracking. The torque spec on these header nuts are actually really low. It's 30 Newton meters, which is only about 22 foot-pounds. That's like nothing. We're gonna do it in two passes. So the first pass I'm gonna do at probably around 15 foot-pounds. All right, we have all of these torqued down. Now we can put on the heat shield. And now for the main ingredient, the Turbski. Before I slap the turbo back on, I do have a new gasket kit. which I did not know existed, but it comes with a whole bunch of goodies. There's honestly probably 2 complete sets in here. Hardware and gaskets is one of those things I would never cheap out on, because over the years, using the cheap stuff just doesn't last, it doesn't hold up, and then you're gonna be chasing issues down the line. So I'm going through this gasket kit, and I'm matching up some washers, and I'm realizing that I'm an idiot. I ordered the RB26 gasket kit. These are for the twin turbos, that's why there's 2. I feel so dumb. That's okay, because the gasket I had on there is not that old, it's still in great condition. But look at how much bigger the RB25 turbo is versus the RB26. And I was super excited to get new lock washers, but these are way too small of a distance. The washers matched up, so that's a huge plus. Don't have to worry about that. But it's just part of the game, ordering the right parts. It was listed as RB25, but I should have just looked up the part number instead of trusting the listing, but it happens. Just gotta move on, make the best out of it. Luckily I saved the old locking tabs, so I'll be using those. And you wanna make sure with turbo bolts that you're using stainless steel. There's a lot of different methods people use to installing these turbo nuts and making sure they don't come loose. I've seen a lot of people that will literally just put a tack weld on the nut to the turbo housing just to prevent it from coming loose. Luckily these locking tabs have worked pretty good for me, so I'm gonna go with that method. We have the turbo nuts all tightened down. Slap that on. Looking good, looking good. And we cannot forget to connect this rear water line. It's all the way back here. Perfect. Can't forget that oil drain clamp. Now we can finally fold in these locking tabs. There's a nice little edge to it, and it just basically prevents the nut from spinning off. Last but not least, we gotta put the turbo outlet on. At this point, I think we're at a really good position where we can look at our to-do list and start checking some stuff off. Got a layer of dust on it. All right, header studs, check. Turbo crush washers, check. Clutch, pressure plate, check. Intercooler fitment. Gonna leave this unchecked until we verify fitment with the tubs in. Oil change, trans fluid, throwout bearing, check. Resurface flywheel / new flywheel, check. Flywheel bolts, check. Prep new subframe. Rack relocation, RB mounts. Well, we got the mounts done, but we haven't relocated the rack yet. I plan on doing that in probably the next video. So I'll go over how to do that and why it's very important. Tighten trans mount, no, that's when it's fully mounted. Speed sensor clearance. Let's knock that out. That's probably the hardest thing on this list, speed sensor clearance. So let's take a look at it. This is the engine, transmission, speed sensor lives right here, very close to the transmission mount. So I showed this in a previous video, but this is how it looks with the engine removed. Here it is, it's all beat up. And I was trying to remember exactly where I needed to shorten this. So I actually pulled up my last video so I can check. So we're gonna make a little box for this also. This marker does not like to drop. So that's probably the highest point where the speed sensor will touch. What I'm gonna do is cut this and then probably cut this as well. And then I'm going to flatten that out and then weld it into position like that. Got this nice and cut up, and I also prepped the metal. Not too pretty, but we're gonna weld this into position, and then I'm gonna probably reinforce this because, I mean, this is already thin metal to begin with, and with us altering the construction of this metal, I definitely want to put another plate somewhere along here. All right, there we go. We got a nice little notch in there. Now I'm gonna use some cardboard and shape up the little bracket I want to make. Fits on there like so. Figured we could weld it to the base here and then hammer this top piece in so it kind of like wraps around a little bit. And that'll be out of 16 gauge metal, which is a lot thicker than what this is. And I've cut this piece out on a piece of metal, and you just kind of go woo, and we'll just check that one right off. So at this point, the engine is ready to go back into the car. And we can finally put the quick release core support to use and see how well it actually works.